I'm Bob Crutchfield. I am the most recent past chair of the Committee on Law and Justice, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session, which was to be one of several events celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Committee on Law and Justice's creation. Unfortunately, it will be the only, it turns out, celebratory event because of let's say climate and changes that have happened that some of you are familiar with. So we were going to have multiple events, but we at least have this one where we can celebrate the 50th year. We want to, this morning, acknowledge the work that's happened over the 50 years of CLAJ's existence. But perhaps more importantly, we want to spend some time looking forward to where the work goes that's so important. Before we start, I wanted to do some acknowledgments. We have at this meetings 4 of the 5 people who have been chairs of the Committee on Law and Justice. Sitting in the back was Charles Welford, who was the first chair of CLAJ and the longest serving member in that role. And Charles, in a large way, deserves much of the credit for what this committee has done and what launched it and all those things. Jeremy Travis is also at these meetings. He was chair in the late aughts and going in, and I was fortunate enough to follow him, and the person following me in this role is Rob Sampson, who will be our discussant and moderator today. The only CLAJ chair that we do not have with us is the late James Q. Wilson. So with the exception of Wilson, we're all here to say, let's go for CLAJ. Just a little bit about the history. CLAJ is a part of the, one other acknowledgement. Emily Bacchus is there, who is the current staff director for the committee. And Rob probably already knows what I knew when I was there, is it's so important to have high quality staff people, and thank you. The National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine are not federal organizations. They're private organizations that do a lot of work with government. The National Academies was, for those who don't know, was founded in 1863 by an act of Congress, and the first commission bringing it into reality was signed by Abraham Lincoln. And its objective was to provide scientific advice to the government. In 1975, the Committee on Law and Justice was created to help to improve decision-making, public policy, and promote understanding and dissemination of research matters involving law and justice. We want to respect that history and look forward, as I said, to what happens next in the next few years. We want to honor the work of the 50 years, but we'll focus on 3 of the more recent panels that have taken place in the last 10 years. You can find more about these panels or all the works of CLAJ if you go to the National Academies Press. From the National Academies Press, you can, for free, download the study reports. But if you want something on your shelf, you're more than welcome, and the press would be happy to have you buy hard volumes of those reports. So we're honoring the past, looking to the future. And I should say that I've told all the participants that they are free to comment as much or as little as they want about the current climate. And it was an easy promise to make, because you can't tell good scholars what they should and shouldn't say anyway, and they're going to do it, so I figured, why waste my time? So we can talk as openly or as however people want to do this. But we're fortunate to have with us today people who were on the study panels that they'll be talking about. And we'll start with Bruce Western, who is currently of the Russell Sage Foundation, who will talk about a study on the growth of incarceration in the United States, which was published in 2014. Then Janet Lawrenson from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, Modernizing Crime Statistics, which was published in 2018. And then Maria Velez from the University of Maryland, who was on the study panel, Reducing Inequality in Crime and Justice, which was published in 2023. And then Rob Sampson will be our discussant and moderator for a conversation. And with that, we'll do that order, and I'll turn it over to Bruce.
Oh, thanks so much, Bob. It's a real treat to be part of this panel, and it's wonderful that we're thinking about the work that CLADGE has done over the last 5 decades, which is extraordinary, and I hope we can also have a conversation about where the work of the committee is going to go over the coming years. So my job today in the panel is to talk about the report that was chaired by Jeremy Travis on the growth of incarceration in the United States, exploring causes and consequences. And as Bob was saying, this was published in 2014, and a lot of the work of this consensus panel happened in, I think, towards the end of 2012 and 2013. And let's hope this works. Yay. So the origin of this panel was deep in the discussions that were happening on the Committee on Law and Justice, and I would say the real movers behind this panel were Jeremy Travis and Ruth Peterson, and Jeremy and Ruth both, I think, had wanted to do some sort of work around the growth in incarceration rates in the United States. We all know that incarceration rates by 2008 were like 5 times higher than its historic average through the 20th century. And a research base had developed by around 2010 that both investigated the causes of the growth in incarceration and the consequences of incarceration. The big obstacle, I think, to getting the consensus panel off the ground was to find the funding for this work. And ultimately, MacArthur and Laurie Garducki at MacArthur and NIJ, and really John Laub at NIJ, they were both instrumental in getting the report off the ground. Once the funding had been secured, a charge was drawn up for the committee. And the charge for the committee had 3 parts. And first, the committee was asked to describe and assess the causes of the growth in incarceration. Second, the committee was asked to look at the consequences of very high rates of incarceration in the United States. And then the third part of the charge was to investigate policy alternatives. Given what we've learned from the research evidence about the causes of the growth and its effects, where should we go in terms of public policy? So this 3-part charge was what the committee was responding to. A committee was assembled, and it was a diverse group, I would say. And as I was sort of preparing these comments, it was even more diverse than I was aware of at the time, or from our contemporary perspective. It looks very diverse. And I would say there are 3 broad groups of people on this committee. A group that I will call practitioners, and this is a pretty heterogeneous group of people who are in important policy roles. There was another group drawn from law, legal studies, and criminology, and there was a third group that consisted of other kinds of social scientists. And in the practitioner group, we had Jeremy, who was the chair of the committee. And I put Jeremy in the practitioner category, but he was at the time the president of John Jay. So, he was coming out of higher education, and so much of his career was devoted to research in the area of criminal justice policy. We had Jeff Beard, who left the committee halfway through to run California DOC. Tony Favello, who was working for Council on State Governments, and he was doing a lot of advocacy work, and he was involved in justice reinvestment. Ricardo Hinojosa, who's a Reagan-appointed federal judge. Jody Rich was doing a lot of work on correctional health care and still is. And Jody was at Brown, but he was a physician as well. In the law and criminology group, Craig Haney, who's we also know as a psychologist, but he was in is in a legal studies program. Dan Nagan was among the criminologists, and Peel, who was a trained economist, and Mike Tonry, who was coming from the law school at Minnesota. And then we had a hell of a lot of social scientists that were neither practitioners or criminologists. Marie Gottschalk, Larry Mead, who was in political science at NYU, Glenn Lowry, the only economist, which I think from today's perspective would be unusual. If a similar panel were being assembled today, we might see more economists, a couple of historians, Khalil Muhammad, Heather Thompson, and then a hell of a lot of sociologists, interestingly, including Bob and Sarah McClanahan, who was a family sociologist, and Diva Page, Robin, myself. So quite a diverse group in terms of discipline, quite a diverse group politically as well. So we had a Reagan-appointed federal judge, and at the one end, and we had people like Craig Haney at the other end, who had done important expert witness work on prison conditions, and Craig's work, I think, was also instrumental in California realignment. So we met for a good 12 months, over 12 months, and the committee landed on three main sets of conclusions. And the first concerned crime. The increase in incarceration may have caused a decrease in crime. There was a lot of evidence for that. The estimates varied widely, and the consensus estimates suggested the growth in incarceration had only a small effect on the crime decline through the 90s and into the 2000s. Second conclusion was about specifically the deterrence and incapacitation effects of incarceration, small, particularly for long sentences. The evidence was very strong on that. The effects of harsh penal policies in the last 40 years have fallen most heavily on blacks and Hispanics, especially the poorest. In terms of the social consequences of incarceration, the evidence was pretty uneven, to be honest, but we could say to the extent that there were significant negative social effects of incarceration, they were overwhelmingly contributed in low-income communities of colour. So now the committee confronted the challenge of making recommendations. And we had a long discussion about how to do this, because a lot of the research evidence was really uncertain. And we weren't entirely sure that we could get from the research evidence to policy conclusions, which was part of our charge, without something else. And the something else that the committee landed on was the idea of normative principles. We're talking about a justice system. What are the normative principles that are rooted in philosophy and legal theory and jurisprudence that might motivate a particular policy direction? And I think an innovation of this report was to develop a discussion around 3 foundational normative principles that should constrain the use of punishment in public policy. And the first principle was parsimony. And the idea of parsimony was that only the minimum level of punishment should be used to achieve the stated public policy purpose. The second principle we called citizenship. I think today we'd probably call it something like human dignity. And the idea there is that people don't forfeit essential rights to their person as a result of being convicted of a crime and incarcerated. And here we're thinking about the conditions of incarceration that people are entitled to and a level of humane and decent treatment. And the third normative principle, and here we're inspired by works of people like John Rawls and Amartya Sen. The third principle was social justice, and the idea of social justice is that the system shouldn't contribute to social inequality, and even most aspirationally, it should do something to reduce social inequality and contribute to justice across groups in society. So with these normative principles, we felt now we had an intellectual case for making recommendations based on research evidence plus a reasoned normative perspective. The report's key recommendation, I think, was, given the small crime prevention effects, particularly of long sentences and the possibly high financial, social and human costs, federal and state policymakers should revise criminal justice policies to significantly reduce the rate of incarceration in the United States. So what was the impact of the report? I think the report was enormously successful in 2 ways. I think it made an important contribution to scholarship, and this graph is intended to suggest that. It's been well cited in the field since publication in 2014. The report's been cited 2,500 times, which is a pretty decent citation count for a consensus panel study from national academies. And it's had staying power. It continues to contribute to the discussion. I think probably even more important is the policy effect. And I think what the report really did was to name high rates of incarceration as a public policy problem we needed to solve. And it did that on the basis of a pretty mature evidence base. So why was the report successful? And I have a few thoughts about this. I think the diversity of the committee was very important, and the committee gained a fairly wide audience because of the diversity, both in terms of discipline and politically. It gained a wide audience as a result. There was a significant body of research that we could draw on in producing our conclusions. I think the conclusions of the report were very well calibrated to the research evidence, and we often conveyed, we're uncertain about a lot of things. We're uncertain how big the impact of incarceration on crime is, for example. And I think this innovation of combining empirical research with normative principles was an important move in a criminal justice conversation that had historically been very punitive. And I think the timing was very good. the politics of criminal justice reform were gathering momentum, and the report was very much in tune with the time. I want to finish. Oh my God, my time's up. Oh, and I want to finish by reflecting a little bit very quickly on the limitations of the report. I think, you know, if the report was underdeveloped in any area, we did not have a lot of specific policy guidance for readers on how exactly high rates of incarceration should be reduced. And I think we could compare other reports. I think of the report on child poverty that Greg Duncan chaired that had a very specific roadmap around child tax credits, for example. I think there are important cases of decarceration that we might have drawn on to help spell out what those policy specifics might look like. California realignment had just happened when we were working, and declines in incarceration in New York had been ongoing since the 1990s. And then finally, I wonder, as I reflect back on the report from a modern perspective, I think oftentimes we took crime very seriously in the report, but I think we often treated crime as a problem to be navigated as we confronted the policy goal of reducing incarceration. And I wonder if from the contemporary perspective, we needed to say more about crime as a compelling social problem to which decarceration might have contributed to an answer. And I think that's a perspective that hadn't quite developed by the time we were working, but it's something I think that's very important for us to think about now. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to be here, so thanks for the invitation, Bob. I've been fortunate to be involved in several types of NAS research groups over the years, and these include things like workshops, roundtables, consensus panels, and I also served on CLADGE for 2 terms. So I've been asked to comment, focus my comments on the most recent work I did for them, and to talk about the impact of that work. I want to mention first that each type of NAS group has a different set of tasks and governing rules, and the work I've done has been funded by different sets of sponsors, mostly federal government sponsors. In the consensus reports I'm going to talk about today, we do not advocate for specific political programs or policies, but we instead worked to critically assess the state of the empirical literature that might inform then subsequent program and evidence-based policy discussions. We also oftentimes would advocate for specific scientific empirical efforts such as new data collections, methodologies, or specific scientific agendas, and provide substantive reasons for why those efforts are necessary. But I think I just briefly mentioned that because I want to say that in terms of an impact of the committee's reports and the rules and practices that they use, all of the reports are almost inevitably very useful research tools because they provide not AI version of a literature review, but a critical state-of-the-art assessment from a wide array of research specialists. They're creating new knowledge by bringing together these diverse groups, as Bruce mentioned, as well as the practitioners who can share their own insights about how their experiences might inform the research agendas and findings. So I would think that every report freely available on the NAP website should be considered essential reading from a research impact. So I served on actually two consensus panels most recently. They were overseen by CLADGE and in conjunction with the Committee on National Statistics, which is otherwise known at the Academy as CNSTAT. It's also a very important committee of the Academy, and I'm not sure exactly what the status of the organization that is right now. But their purpose is to provide advice to the nation and the federal government that can lead to improved data and statistical methods upon which to base public policy. They are the coordinating group at the NAS that helps to improve our nation's indicators about essential aspects of society. These include measures about the economy, such as unemployment, poverty, labor force participation, welfare, crime, public health, education, immigration, transportation, and many other things. And very importantly, they've been key advisors about the methodology and uses of the decennial census, which are critical here. They also assess the work of statistical agencies and issue a guidebook that's titled Principles and Practices for a Federal Statistical Agency. And this is a well-known, regularly updated guidebook. It's well-known by all statisticians as well as federal civil servants. So I'm going to briefly mention this earlier before I talk about modernizing project. This first CLADGE CNSTAT project I served on was titled The Panel to Review the Programs of the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It was chaired by Bob Groves, who would later become the director of the Census Bureau, and it resulted in two reports, the first in 2008, Surveying Victims, Options for Conducting the National Crime Victimization Survey, and the second in 2009, Ensuring the Quality, Credibility, and Relevance of U.S. Justice Statistics. And Bruce also served on that committee, Bruce Wester. Surveying Victims is a goldmine for researchers if you're interested in the history of the methodology and the purpose of the NCVS, and it has many detailed suggestions about how the methodology of the survey might move forward in the short and long term to meet the needs of various stakeholder groups, improve the data's impact, and improve its cost effectiveness. So from a research perspective, if you want to know why, for example, we have the victimization data that we have, why the questions are framed as they are, why the data has been collected by census instead of private companies, how changes to the survey are actually made, this is the report for you. The second report, though, reviewed the entire set of BJS data collections and discussed where the agency's data were most complete and where there were major gaps that limited our ability to understand crime and cases in the civil and criminal justice systems. The second report also included discussions of the legislative mandates that are affecting the agency's work, the limited resources available to them to do the work that they're mandated by Congress to do, and the importance of maintaining adherence to the principles and practices in order to ensure the data's credibility and trust among those who supply and use the data. So there's no doubt in my mind that these two reports had an important impact on the direction that BJS would eventually take with respect to the future of the NCVS and the focus of the agency on additional projects over the 8 years following the report's publication. And there's always concern that, these are kind of in-the-weeds reports. They're not a fascinating cocktail conversation, but unless there's some people in this room. But they're always concerned that these reports will just sit on a shelf after you do all this volunteer work. And no one who serves on a committee wants to spend hundreds of hours doing something that no one even reads. But this was not the case in these two reports. What I would say is these reports, I'm trying to make an underlying point here, these reports were written in the last few years of George Bush's term as president, and they were completed shortly before President Obama took office. They encouraged the development, the reports encouraged the development of both short-term and long-term changes to the NCVS, such as increasing sample size, which would allow for subnational estimates of victimization. There were new questions added to the survey, and there was statistical work to assess the capacity of the data for a variety of purposes. And it also encouraged a longer-term effort for a full redesign of the survey, which eventually was done and implemented in 2024 year data collection, the first report of which has not come out from the new data that's on the survey. However, all the decision-making processes are documented on the BJS website. So the data gaps outlined in the second report were also given serious attention during the following years. This includes improving measures of deaths in custody, arrest-related deaths, campus climate, and BJS would eventually then go on to sponsor another NAS panel to assess the nation's competing estimates of rape and sexual assault and how to improve these estimates for the nation and do it on the NCBS. And there's many more examples of BJS work during that period, at 8 years, that were noted in the two reports. The reports had an impact because there was federal support for making these improvements at the time, and because Jim Lynch, who was also on the panel, and then Bill Sable served as directors of BJS and helped lead and sustain these efforts. This more recent panel that I was part of was entitled the Panel on Modernizing the Nation's Crime Statistics, and I served as chair of that panel. It also produced two reports, the first in 2016, which was Defining and Classifying Crime, and the second in 2018, New Systems for Measuring Crime. They document in great detail the extensive data gaps in the US data on crime and the impact of the lack of this type of information on empirically based policy efforts and research. It proposes and provides a new classification for crime for statistical purposes, informed by the previous work in the UN and work that's gone on around the world. And it was designed so that it could be updated regularly instead of the static UCR that we had from 1929 till fairly recently. And it proposed a governance system that we thought might be effective for getting this work actually done. We also described the many challenges that are going to be involved in measuring new forms of crime, such as cybercrime and the like, and recognized that it would necessarily be a system, a coordinated system of data gathering systems, not just police and victim surveys, but also private data company, federal, civil, and criminal casework. But there was no empirical evidence, and there still is none, though we have life to teach us these lessons, but there's no empirical evidence about how anything we could propose on the committee would actually, in terms of governance, get the work done, push on it, even though everyone agreed that, yes, this would be great to have. So we discussed different options for the development and governance. I've already spoken about these two reports in various venues, including my presidential address a couple years ago, and I'm not going to rehash all those statements, but I want to make a few points about the impact of these reports. So how a country actually does this, modernize its crime statistics, when is not obvious, and it has been much easier in countries where there's mandated reporting by police to their central units for aggregation. In any case, the ability to do so depends on the enlarged willingness on the functioning of its government institutions. And so shortly after this panel completed its work, several of us on the committee met with persons at the Office of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, to discuss the recommendations. We did that because OMB was the group that prompted FBI and BJS to sponsor this work, and we became convinced that OMB was best suited to set up the structure for coordinating the many agencies that would need to be involved in this process and who would and contribute data to the system. My impression at the time from the conversations was that they were interested. I mean, after all, they prompted the development of the panel at the beginning anyway. But those discussions occurred about a few months before Trump was put into his first term and during his first term say that there's little sign that his administration was interested in modernizing crime statistics. Nonetheless, several improvements to crime were already ongoing from the previous report and continue to do so at BJS and at especially many research and development projects. And there was, of course, the shift that BJS helped do, moving towards the NIBRS data collection system, which is now much better than it was at the beginning of the shift by providing resources and support to many different agencies. And the NCVS long-term redesign development work continued as well. So now we're fast forward to the Biden administration years, and the work continued, particularly the implementation of the new redesign NCVS. But one legislative impact, I think, was strongly influenced by the modernizing work. I'm not a government person. I'm not a political scientist either, so this has all been a learning experience for me. But one legislative effort was passed in 2022. It was called the Better Cybercrime Metrics Act. What I do know about the process is that on several occasions I had rather lengthy and interesting conversations with a staffer, sorry I forgot his name, of Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii. And this person studied the reports in detail and knew much about the various forms of crimes committed and facilitated by technology. I do know there were several unsuccessful attempts to get a bill passed, but finally there was a bipartisan support for a bill passed in May 22. So that bill includes many provisions. It required the FBI to report these metrics on cybercrime, just as they report data on other crimes. They encourage local and federal law enforcement to report these kinds of crimes to the FBI, and they required BJS to consider including additional questions to its supplements and the NCVS for identity theft and also other types of fraud victimization. And it also led to another report, another CNSTAT CLADS collaboration that just came out this year, directed by the same project director who was at the Academy on the other crime reports. And that was, I've only read the summaries of those reports, but it was taking the work that we proposed and doing it a little bit further. So, where are we now? I'm not sure. There's so many challenges to doing the work under good conditions, and these aren't. So the biggest challenges over the long term have always been resources and the governance and coordination of the systems. BJS funding is complex, vulnerable, and it's not looking good these days in terms of these kinds of things, in my opinion. The other issue is that because the governance requires, we argued, or recommended, a strong federal presence involving many entities, you know, I still stand by that as a reasonable recommendation. I think the committee would, but we assumed a functioning federal government behaving legally and responsibly. And I'm at a loss now. So I'm just trying to keep up. And here's some resources for the rest of you if you're interested in keeping up. There are many groups keeping close eyes on the situation. The American Statistical Association, the Professional Association of Statisticians does that. They have some great resources about the federal budget, the health of federal stat agencies, and monitoring of stat agencies. The Council on Criminal Justice, Amy Solomon, former Assistant Attorney General, head of OJP, is a senior fellow there now, and just her and Solomon and Pearl issued 2 reports this summer on what's exactly at stake, what's happening, programs on the impacts of all of that on the cuts on policy and programs. We know many programs and policy have been cut. COSA, of which the ASC is a member, provides almost real-time data on updates to appropriations activities, and helping us all understand the BLS. If you're not familiar, the director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics was fired by Trump, and apparently didn't like the numbers, and so there's a discussion there. And then the last set I would recommend for those of you, there's something at the Population Reference Bureau that you can just sign up for their information feeds. It's the Federal Data Forum. These are all the links there. They're working on, they are coordinating the data saving activity that's going on. And I mentioned that in case you have data that you feel might be affected. You might want to get involved with this group and ask them to help save your data. Data that you use. They get support from Georgetown University. They have their something called the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown, and I like the name, Massive Data. So it sounds like a vault. So anyway, I am at a bit of a loss right now because I don't know how to make recommendations. I can discuss the impact, but the point was the same kinds of reports can have an enormous impact depending on the historical context, the timing of the release, and the fact that the modernizing kind of got sidelined for a bit, then came back and was going okay, and now I don't know. Couldn't call anybody up at the federal government last week when I was trying to figure out what to say about this. So those are my comments. So I'm done.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's been an honor to be part of the National Academies, and I thought of my job today, is to really just represent what this report, Reducing Racial Inequality in Crime and Justice, Science, Practice, and Policy, and what we did. Similar to what Bruce just said, this report came about by the pioneering efforts for many years of Jeremy Travis and Ruth Peterson, so we're indebted to them for this work. And I just want to say, mostly I'm going to be speaking and sticking close to the report, but every once in a while I'll add in a few things of my own, and that would be including that this was an honor of a lifetime to be part of this group. So the committee was large, diverse, brought in a lot of different ideas, methodologies, which is really the key to a consensus panel. It can be challenging at times, but it really does yield, I think, really important work. And this report was co-chaired by Khalil Muhammad and our very own Bruce Western here. And we had study sponsors that are listed here. You can see there's a theme of which organizations are supporting the kind of work that we do at the National Academies. The committee was formed to really address these statements of tasks, and you can read them yourself, but I'm just going to ad-lib a little bit of what they're really getting us to do, which is the first question really is about taking stock of the predictors, the patterns, the drivers of things feeding into criminology, the offending, victimization, and crime patterns in general, and what might be some efforts to reduce racial inequalities in these kinds of outcomes. The second question is really looking at the system part of it, right? Both does the criminal justice system itself exacerbate racial inequalities, and then what efforts are there out there that scientifically suggest or indicate that they might reduce disparities in these criminal justice outcomes. And then really the third question is where we got to dig into the evidence and really think about what might work to reduce the racial inequalities that we spent a lot of time trying to document in the first part of the report. So that's really what we were charged with doing. And I do want to point out that the sort of signature for those of you who may not be as familiar with the National Academies and these reports is that their signature move, right, is to build everything on a consensus in the evidence that exists at the time, right? And so it really, everything that is going to be put into print really draws on that spirit, right? That it has to be empirically based and people have to agree that it's robust enough. Bird's eye view of what this report does is it does 3 major key takeaways. The first that we came to signal, we think in the report, is that criminal justice reform has happened at every stage of the system. 2, the criminal justice reform is not alone enough, and we spend a fair amount of time. This is a 400-page document. We spend a lot of time also thinking about non-criminal system policies and how those can shape these inequalities that I'm going to talk about very quickly. And then we also make, based on the evidence, that we should be investing in community-based, non-criminal policy solutions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But again, these were these kind of bird-eye views of what the report is trying to achieve. So one of the major goals, again, at the statement of the task, was to really show key patterns in inequality within crime victimization and the criminal justice system. So this is just one major highlight that we had in the first part of the report. And again, there's a lot more patterns that we could talk about in the Q&A, but most importantly are racial disparities in homicide victims. And we also tracked patterns in the 2010s and looking at how some of those inequalities were exacerbated as the homicide rates grew in 2014 and 2016, and then again in 2019 and 2020. Those are just, again, real highlights there. We also point out that at the same time that these inequalities exist, we see major differences in the clearance rates for homicide victims. Then what we do in terms of the criminal justice system, we try to track out at every stage that the evidence seems quite robust to make some various conclusions. I'm not going to read over these specifics. I just want to focus on just maybe the first, sort of the entry point where you see, police stops. That they are roughly, I went ahead and now I don't know how to go back. Okay, police officers stop and search Black Americans at rates that are higher than any other racial and ethnic group. And then police encounters with the public are also more likely to use force against Black Americans than whites. And what you see, and then we look at arrest, pretrial detention, sentencing, correction, et cetera. And so what you can do is look at the book and actually look at key stages that you might be interested in, and then you get a good sense of what is it that we know? What can we say confidently about what we know? Then what we also look at are the social drivers of these inequalities. And I think I want to make a point also that in this report, we try to embed our understanding of these inequalities in historically based practices, and so we make those connections quite explicitly in this report, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I think that's important that we did that. In particular, we point out that there's a historical legacy of racial exclusion that manifests itself in housing and wealth patterns, et cetera, that then help us understand how we get these racial differences in, let's say, homicide victimization. And so we point those and try to make that case quite explicitly in the report. And in particular, I'll just focus on one of the major arguments that we make, which is that there are important racial differences in wealth. And I'll just point out the first point, concentrated poverty is particularly high in areas where African Americans, American Indians, and Hispanics disproportionately reside. And again, for some of us, this is me speaking, so for some of us, we know this, but the whole point of this report is that there's going to be a lot of people reading the report who may not have this kind of information. And so then they're able to look at it, get the citations, and be able to make the case in terms of how these structural underpinnings are important. And it then sets in motion the kinds of recommendations that we're going to make in just a few slides ahead. Then the second part of the report really focuses on policy solutions. What does the evidence suggest? Can we make conclusions? Can we make recommendations based on the evidence? And so I just want to talk very quickly about a few points that we make in that second part of the report. The first is that we really think that in the report that the states and localities and the federal government should explore ways to reduce police stops, searches, jail detention, prison admissions, and long sentences that would further reduce racial disparities. And again, this is a recommendation that we make in Chapter 8 of the report. And I'll just point out just one of the points that we make, which is the number 1 there, that we should limit jail detention to only those charged with serious crimes who pose a serious and immediate risk of harm or flight. So these are very concrete suggestions that we make in the report, just as an example. Then, given the task of thinking about non-criminal legal policy solutions, we have a whole chapter that really draws heavily on Rob's work on, and many of you in the room, the role of community cohesion, collective efficacy, community social organization, where we try to think about how safety can be a function of what communities do and how they can be empowered. So it's not that we see it as a cohesive and only one kind of program. These programs are really going to have to be varied based on the specifics of the community, but we think that community organization in general will be the most effective way in improving safety, and we make that case in the Chapter 6. Building healthy communities and reducing crime require investments in community capacity to define and advance safety and harm and inequality associated with criminal justice involvement. And in the report, we discuss issues related to community violence interruption as an example, that we thought there seemed to be some suggestions that could work, and we propose in the report that we should possibly fund that sort of research. And in particular, we say federal and state agencies should explore the significant expansion of community-driven pilot programs that combine with strategies to evaluate the results, so tying that innovation with some strategy to evaluate the results. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A if we want. Then reducing inequality through public investments. Again, continuing to explore non-criminal policy approaches to improving safety and reducing harm from the system. We have a variety of fruitful directions where we think there's a potential for social justice reform that shows potential, again, the key there is potential, for reducing racial inequalities in crime, victimization, and criminal justice outcomes. I'll just point out number 7 as an example where we saw some promising research that by improving the built environment through greening and lead remediation programs has the potential to reduce crime and thereby reducing racial inequalities in crime and victimization. And so there are a lot of ideas there. Again, we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Part of the consensus panel and our charge was also to think about some basic solutions, both in terms of policy, but also the data infrastructure, which ties in nicely to what Janet was discussing earlier. So, and then also grant making. We had chapters 9 and 10 of the report focus on sort of the role of grants, grant making, et cetera. So we encourage promising new practices, seed innovation, add value to efforts that accelerate systemic reform. Something that we spent a lot of time talking about was the data infrastructure, which is number 2. We need a 21st century data infrastructure with timely, accurate, curated information that we can disseminate, and it's needed at all levels of government. And that will be one way to reduce racial disparities, of course, but then we need to be able to integrate those systems, integrate that data infrastructure across systems so that they can speak to each other. And again, these are things that we see as particularly urgent, which I know will be a topic we'll talk about in the Q&A. And then the community support. Another theme that came up during our 2 years together working on this report was that we need to figure out a way to partner researchers with community, and how do we bring in community voice and an understanding about the role and the plight of crime, victimization, offending, and then also the criminal justice system and its harms. And so we suggest that we need to figure out a way to have an ongoing system of data collection and surveys that would provide data on the views of resident safety, develop reliable and valid measures of the full range of residents' viewpoints, because we want to figure out a way to get everybody's views on how they're thinking about their community. And then this is where we also make the plug for doing community-driven pilot programs for community violence interruptions with that strong evaluation strategy. And then at the end of the report, we focus on a future research agenda. We're trying to set the stage. It's only been a couple years, so you all can be the judge of how much it sets stage for this current crop of research, but there are some ideas that we really think we need to move the field forward in terms of understanding race and inequality. We need to move beyond a black-white divide. We need to focus on other groups that are experiencing high levels of victimization, for instance, indigenous communities, the role of immigration, right? Things like that the literature is not as robust. And then we need to link data across criminal justice, social welfare agencies so we can track relationships and trends, and then analyze alternatives to the criminal justice system. And I'll want to just end with two things, one is the report page is really valuable, and I have it up here, but they also have a bunch of interactive resources, graphics, policy briefs, report highlights, et cetera. So I highly encourage you all to go look at that. And then, given the charge, and I'm going over just 20 seconds, Rob, this is just me as an academic. I think there's 5 key reasons this report matters. It clearly documents the linkages between historical practices of racial exclusion to contemporary inequalities in crime, victimization, and system outcomes. So it's your go-to to make that case. Now it's in mainstream report. It provides in one comprehensive document what we know about inequalities in crime, victimization, and involvement with the criminal justice system, so you don't have to keep looking at a bunch of places. You can go to one stop. It makes the case that this is something that Bruce and I spent a lot of time on our road show when we were talking about the report, that we need to make the case, and we do in the study, that you can achieve public safety and achieve reductions in racial inequality. It's a false dichotomy, and we can talk more about that. We provide key recommendations that have the potential to reduce racial inequality, and then lastly, it just spotlights the need for a major overhaul in our data infrastructure. Thank you.
All right, thank you for a terrific panel. As Bob noted at the beginning, my role is as a discussant moderator, not a discussant. And we've heard a lot from the 3 presenters on these reports. And if you think about it, the history of CLAJ and what it's produced is really remarkable, as you've heard evidence on that. And that was part of the goal of this, in a way, was sort of celebratory, right, in terms of looking backwards. But we really need to look forward as well. Times have changed, and I think we need to have a discussion about that. But first, let me also thank not just the presenters, but the past chairs of CLAJ, Bob, who did a terrific job, and Jeremy, and I think Charles is somewhere back there, so thank you all. It's an honor to be chair, I started in July. When I agreed to do this, it was like a year ago before the shit hit the fan. Talk about timing, Janet. It was, but seriously, it's a challenge. The future is uncertain. As you know, there's chaos in Washington. The funding cuts are severe. It's harmed CLADGE, to be brutally honest. And we are in times really of anti-scientific sentiment in the government and distrust in institutions, including research, the government. So CLADGE has a big challenge, but we're going to try to be up to that challenge. So in the spirit of looking forward, we have a terrific audience here, a terrific panel, so we thought we would generate a discussion to the extent that we can. So please come to the mic, and I'll start by asking my colleagues, or put 3 questions on the table. We don't have to answer them all, I can pick and choose, but one is, which law and justice related questions feel both urgent and answerable in the next 12 to 24 months? And the reason for that framing is that's the typical time span of a consensus report, and you've heard the results of those reports, and they're really terrific. On the other hand, CLADGE is also thinking about other kinds of reports and products. So the second question is really what, and that's why we want to think about both 12 to 24 months, but also even perhaps shorter, right? Like a workshop or something that could be done in 6 months. On the flip side, we need to think about longer term horizons. What requires NAS-like independence, thinking out over 3 or 5 years? Now that's hard to do in this era of what's happening now, but risk-taking is essential in science, and CLADGE has to be on the forefront of that. So what are the big issues that need that long time horizon? And the third, which is really related actually to the first 2, but it's somewhat independent, and that is, what are the biggest evidence gaps impeding policy today? And I think a lot of people are interested in that question. So I'll throw it open to the panel and to the audience, and I will moderate the discussion. So, would anyone like to start up here?
I can start. This might be on everybody's mind, but I think in a sort of a short-term problem to focus on would be immigration, crime control. So the role of deportations, the role of ICE, how it's affecting the communities. I think that's something we could probably even do a workshop on. So I won't go longer in detail about that, but that would be one suggestion.
That was in my notes too.
Okay.
Can I piggyback on that? Because I think what we know about communities that came out of multiple studies is criminal justice and law enforcement can disrupt communities. And if you think about what's happening with immigration enforcement now, and think about how the community disruption that's obviously taking place, predictably that'll lead to increases in crime. So that's something we should, in my opinion, address right now to the extent that we can.
Yeah.
It's a start. Okay. I think related to that is the issue of criminal justice and non-criminal justice strategies for community safety. I think, as you say, Bob, there's reasons to think that the system, in the way that it operates, can make communities less safe. In fact, and there are other kinds of policy instruments that don't have anything to do with the system that can make communities safer. And I think there's a lot of research around social policy, a lot of research around how space is designed and used that can make an important contribution to how we think about safe communities too.
So because my focus is somewhat different here today, I just I know that there's going to be a need for longer-term projects, but when they could actually begin, when there would be the will to begin, it's hard to, and the data to begin, it's hard to know. For example, when new data collection begins and gets coordinated, there's a need, I think, to document it from a kind of to take a look at what kinds of approaches are successful in actually gathering the data, because it's not just floating out there. You have to, why would groups, agencies, private entities supply the data? I don't think given the issues about public trust in government institutions and academia and research, I don't know if we understand how that's changing or whether it really is threatened. To your point about, Bob's point about public trust, I did see at the council website that they quote a project that says this public actually believes we need data. Businesses are very concerned about not having accurate data from BLS, for example. But I want, if there's a way to document that, keep tabs on it, that could be a short project. And then when the data comes in, the longer term projects is how reliable and valid it is. That's going to take a lot of expertise that's not, from a variety of specialists.
And be thinking in the audience too about questions, issues, topics that you think are important. If you want to queue up or just ask questions from your seat as we continue. We have a few more minutes, probably 10 minutes. So please, CLADGE often does public workshops and sort of a listening tour, as it were. So your input would be terrific. One issue I'd throw on the table is, I guess I'd phrase it as aging in the criminal justice system. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the projections on incarceration rates have dropped dramatically, which means there's going to be increasing release of prisoners, particularly elderly, and vulnerable populations. There's a long tradition of research, of course, on reentry, but I think this is going to be increasingly important, and society has changed, obviously, dramatically. The supports perhaps are going to be even more reduced given budget cuts in the federal government. So I think that it's sort of a demographic transition in part, but also the falling incarceration rates are going to have tremendous implications for communities, because we know that they're not released randomly into communities. They're going to go into the most vulnerable communities, and the numbers are going to be skyrocketing. So I would put that as a longer term horizon. It's not something that could be answered in 12 months. Jeremy.
Yeah, hi, Jeremy Travis here. So a number of you on the panel have made reference to the role that CLADGE and the National Academy has played in taking a look at the federal infrastructure, NIJ, BJS, for supporting criminal justice research and innovation. And given where we are now, I think it's a good time to have sort of our version of Project 2025, to ask let's be hopeful for a moment, if there's an opportunity to rebuild that infrastructure, should it look like what it's always looked like for the past 50 years, or should it in fact be quite different? And I think this is a blue sky moment to really have some people who have experience with those agencies as working in them, or consumers, or just looking at them from afar. And who better than the National Academy to do that, given their consensus reports, assuming that they can also be dreamers for a moment and say, what should that look like? And really get prepared with a set of legislative proposals for what the new, dare we say, LEA, OJP, something, what that should look like, and particularly, Janet, on what the role of the federal government should be in collecting data and how that infrastructure should be built out in the future. But I would say the same thing for research. What's the role of the federal government in promoting research, and certainly what's the role of the federal government in promoting innovation? And I think that's all up for grabs. So there's a way to take this very sad state of affairs right now and just turn it and say, let's take advantage of this moment to think about what it should look like if we have a chance of resurrecting this infrastructure.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's a terrific point. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that on the panel.
You know, just thinking about Jeremy's comments and about the presentations we've heard, they gel together, you know, in terms of the recommendations from all three of the reports and from other areas that would provide undergirding for doing that kind of reporting that Jeremy's suggesting, that kind of consensus building for a new 2025 kind of project.
Can I add, no, I think this is sort of piggybacking on Jeremy's comment in a way. I think part of the conditions for the challenges that we're currently facing is a real distrust in science and a distrust in social science in particular, and in the research on trust in science. Social science is distrusted much more than the physical and natural sciences. And I think we should reflect on that as we're sort of entertaining a rebuilding project that Jeremy describes. And I think we haven't always done as great a job as we should have at showing the utility of social research. And you know, at times we've retreated to an internal conversation within the academic research community. And I think a version of this rebuilding project has to be very outward-facing, and it has to communicate the utility of this work for society as a whole. And I sometimes worry that we've not always done as great a job at that as we should.
I agree with that. I guess the question really is, is there something specific CLAD could do? How would we address this? No easy answers there, but I think this is the $64,000 question in terms of an institution that's built on research and data and science. How do you deal with the fact that its products are now being put out into a socially changed world where that's distrusted? And I think that's what you're saying, and how you grapple with that is a fundamental problem. I think we don't have good research on how to change opinion on science, I guess. And you know, it's not just crime policy, obviously, whether it's climate change policy or anything else. This is something that the Academy is grappling with writ large. Was there a question? Yes.
Do you want to use the
microphone?
Kind of in line with the last two questions, if we engage in a more robust data collection effort where more agencies are buying in, we might see that it looks like crime is increasing in the country, and I wonder how that would impact policymakers and politicians. How do we warn against, we will see this initial increase because there's more buy-in and more agencies are reporting, but it's not necessarily this huge, get tough on crime, we don't need to enter another punitive wave. So I guess how would we warn against that natural inclination towards a more punitive policy when we see this trend of increasing crime if more agencies are reporting, and just, I guess, try to tell them or explain that it is just a numbers thing as opposed to an actual behavioral issue within the country.
I'm looking at you, Janet.
Thanks a lot.
Another tough question.
Yeah, so I agree that, especially in the case of national statistics, they seem to be somewhat removed from people's lives, except for the case of markets where they're looking at jobs reports and weekly labor force and for investment purposes and the like. for crime purposes, people are much more interested in some of their local and state efforts. And my work is not, I've not thought as much about all the local stuff that is essentially a compilation of many, many groups putting stuff together to their centralized state units or forward to the federal government. I think much more, if one option is to look at what can be shown at a state and local level. And I saw Jeremy pointed me to the Vital City website that New York has, and I thought recently they did a lovely job presenting crime statistics for New York in a very clear, straightforward way, clear language in 2 graphs, just showing how crime in New York City and its trends compared to the other 20 populous cities, and how it does so within each of the boroughs. So it's both localized information as well as comparative information that also tries to work in trends. It's quite a interesting model that caught my eye. And I think that the more you can show people at the local or local state level what's going on and how it's partitioned and how that compares to similar kinds of places before you ratchet it up to the nation, I think that kind of an effort would be useful. It's a challenge because not every local place has that, but if we could just start doing that at a small scale, it might lead to a broader assemblage of value, perceived value in this information.
Yeah, great point. I think we have time for one more question. Thomas, do you want to come to the mic?
Sure. I participated some time ago in a NASM panel. I'm not even sure if it was a CLAJ panel on predictive policing. And I continue to, as we sort of look at the role of technological innovation, feel like we continue to address this issue again and again through the lens of a particular innovation. Right now, everybody's most concerned about artificial intelligence. But I think it would be really great for CLAJ to take on this issue for technology innovation generally and not on a specific technological innovation, so that as we proceed with innovation after innovation after innovation, there are some basic rules of the road that can be applied to new ones, and that we're not sort of constantly filtering through this particular innovation, each of which will be different from one another.
Yeah, thank you. Another terrific point. In fact, the last CLAJ meeting when we had funders talking with us, and that issue came up. I mean, as you know, AI is on everyone's mind, but it's more than just that. It's technology is changing everything, and that includes data, includes surveillance, includes algorithms, and so I think that's a fundamental challenge. I see that we are actually 1 minute, 2 minutes over time, so unfortunately we have to end, but let me conclude by thanking the panel again, the past chairs, and the audience for terrific questions, so thank you all.